Alright, this is another video that I've been meaning to make now for ages, and it's it's really important to me because I'm kind of person. I hold myself sort of personally responsible for perpetuating this myth that I believed for years as well. So I'm just as guilty as many other people are in going along with this. And basically, there's this there's this there's this sort of general train of thought or opinion or whatever you want to call it that's out there basically that says that bagpipes were banned in Ireland and Scotland, uh, and it's always by like the British slash English, right? So that's basically it. Like on the outside, it seems like a real simple thing to just say, and this is what's said all the time. It's just basically said, yeah, you know, the English like banned the bagpipes in Ireland like uh, years ago, and they've always sort of banned them as an instrument of war and all of that. And then they done the same in Scotland around the time of Culloden, banned them as an instrument of war. And that's the real simple outlook to it. It's always basically that this ban was in place, or bans were placed in an effort to stop piping, and it's always by basically the English, right? So again, it's like blame England on everything. Um, and I basically believed this for years. I did. I'm ashamed to say, and so I want to make this video to basically I want to get my teeth into this and pull it all apart, and let's take it back to it's not just as simple as that. There's layers to this, like everything else. There's layers to it, and it's I want to look into those layers. I want to have a look at these statements. I want to know where they come from. I want to know what evidence is there and everything else. So basically, what we're going to address is where these myths came from, because that's what they are. They're myths. It's it's not the entire truth. There's a partial truth in them, but it's only partial, and it's certainly not as basic and as simple as what I've just outlined in the beginning, because that's what we're told. So to just quickly say where these come from, right? The references that the origins of the myth is basically um, that that there was a ban on going back to the statutes of Kilkenny, which was in 1367. So that's the earliest sort of reference that they go back to. And this gets mixed up all the time in so much as it's like, okay, the statutes of Kilkenny tried to ban everything that was Gaelic and Irish, including the Brehon laws, right? That's the simplistic version of the statutes of Kilkenny, right? So that's the first one, Statutes of Kilkenny. That's for Ireland, and as I say, we're going back to 1367 in that. The other ones are relating to Scotland, which is basically the Disarming Act from 1715, and it came into effect in 1716. Then in 1725, there was a new act disarming the Highlands. And then in 1746, there was the Act of Prescription and also the Dress Act. They're from 1746. That's kind of the, Culloden time. And then there's this kind of famous instance that relates to that about Piper James Reid from Ogilvy's regiment. That he was hung because basically he played the bagpipes, and the bagpipes were considered an instrument of war, and so therefore they were banned. So that's where this idea of the ban comes from. So each of these things, but how many people have actually stopped to go back and look at these sources and actually read the Statute of Kilkenny and these disarming acts and everything else, right? I would argue very few. And I'm going to do that for you here. So we need to go back to these sources. We need to look at what they actually say and what actually happened at the time, and stop drawing these big broad brushstroke conclusions that just basically blames the English on everything for banning bagpipes. And I really feel that like this really strongly needs to be addressed because there's pipers now all over the world saying this, and it's becoming the general kind of perception that this is fact, this is what happened, and this is. I, I want you to please give this your fairest attention and hear me out on this because I'm trying to be. I'm trying not to take sides in this, and I've always said that like I hate making anything political. Like I'm not a political person, and unfortunately, if the bagpipes as an instrument can be symbolic of both Ireland and Scotland, right? We all know that, and they can be his symbolic instruments of history and kind of whose side you're on in history, and so it is a powerful image, and but then that can be used as a sort of a it can be used, and I've discussed this in other videos about like the image of the piper, the historic image of the piper, and that deep kind of historic association with the countries of, as I say, especially Ireland and Scotland, and what the instrument stands for. And oftentimes it's hijacked, I find, by people who are trying to push a certain agenda. That whether that's, and it goes both ways. That's the paradox. I've done a video about this before. That's the paradox of the image of the piper, is that he is used in both ways. He's used as a nationalistic independence kind of Republican type image for both Ireland and Scotland, as this kind of, the rebel, the defiant kind of rebel that's playing this ancient instrument against all the odds of centuries of oppression, and will continue to play and lead the people basically to freedom. That's one image of the piper that's quite strong in both Ireland and Scotland, but especially in Ireland because we did get independence, and we all know the history, right? I'm not going to go into the history of Ireland and Scotland. I'm going to try and just focus on the image of the piper, and I'm going to try and be as fair as possible. So on one side you have this, on one side you have this. This is what the piper stands for. Also, though, on the other side of that is you have the bagpiper, the classic kilted bagpiper, as a symbol of the British Empire. Yes, as the sort of Scottish / Irish take on the symbol of the British Empire. But that's essentially what it means, and it's because of the British Empire. It's because the British Army, and used pipers, Irish and Scottish pipers, leading regiments, and pipe bands were formed, and all that sort of stuff. That the classic image of the piper, especially the kilted soldier piper, is also an image of Britishness. So that's the real kind of paradox of this, because it means both things. Now I'm glad, thankfully, that Uilleann Pipes doesn't kind of have that same kind of either imperial image, because it's not considered, the Uilleann Pipes weren't sort of considered ever British or part of the British Empire kind of thing. They're mostly considered as sort of a nationalist Irish type of symbol. But luckily, it hasn't stayed like Irish music is so popular around the world and so evocative, that it's not a purely political symbol. It's not just everyone who straps on a set of Uilleann Pipes or picks up a flute or a tin whistle or a bodhrán isn't can be from any type of political identity or background or whatever. It's not a kind of a conscious decision that lots of people make. Now, some people will do it for that reason. Some people are drawn towards music as a symbol of your nationalism or whatever like that. I'm not saying that it's completely devoid of it, but because Ilan, like, what I really, and I'm getting myself caught up here into knots, is these images of, it just shows you the power of what a bagpipe can evoke. And that's kind of that's really what I want to sort of pull apart here. It's I want to get to the root of this, and I want this myth of the ban is the perfect example of what needs to be said about bagpipes and the image of the image of the piper, and this idea, as I say, that England is the fault of everything. Now, there's layers and layers of history and culture in this, and I just want to address it in my fairest way possible. Because, as I say, I believed that for years. I did myself, and I perpetuated the myth. Anytime I played me pipe, not every time, but many times when I play me pipes, either set of pipes, like either my Uilleann pipes, my big Highland bagpipes, or my Scottish small pipes, invariably you're going to be asked a few questions about the history of the instrument or the history of your regalia, like that's, say the kilt, for example, like that. And all of this falls into it. And I used to say the same thing. Yeah, well, I used to believe that, basically, we played the bagpipes for centuries in Ireland, and the English invaded, and they were always trying to get rid of it, and because it was a symbol of like Irish warfare and all that, and the big like war pipes, and even that, like calling them war pipes, like, is a real trigger. Because obviously for battle and warfare is the first thing you think about. But that's a total, well, not a total misnomer, but it's a partial misnomer, because war pipes is just a derivative of the Irish word mór, which means big or great. So in Gaelic it's like na Pbr War. That means the big pipes are the large pipes, the great pipes, na Pbr War. Because mór is the Irish for big, and I'm not going to go too much into linguistics here, but when you're using big as a descriptive word, I don't know the proper terminology for this, is an adjective or whatever. But when you use it, like, the word big on its own is just mór. That's M-O fada R. Fada is like an accent in French. So M-O fada R means big. But when you apply that to a word, like say the big stick, it's an bata war. Bata is a stick, right? So an bata war. The M gets softened with a H. So M turns into either a W sound or a V sound even. So in some dialects, like I believe in Scots Gaelic, it's vor. And I think in the southern dialect of Irish, like the Kerry Irish and Cork Irish, it's also pronounced vor. Maybe in Connemara as well. But in Ulster, it's pronounced war, like a W. So, na Pbr War just means the big pipes, which I find interesting because that also signifies that there was a smaller pipe played, which sort of sends this off into another direction, which is going off in that pastoral pipe topic that I've covered in other videos too, which signifies to me anyway. So why would they call it na Pbr War, and instead of just na Pbr, the pipes? It's because there was I'm gathering is that it signifies that there's a big bagpipe, making a distinction from a smaller bagpipe. So na Pbr War, it just means big bagpipes, but Pbr War obviously sounds like English war, like battle. And of course, they had that reputation because they were played into battle. Like, it's, countless accounts of Irish bagpipers leading both Irish and British/English soldiers and regiments into battle down through the centuries, right? Plenty of examples of it. So they've been given this name, like the war pipes. And today, unfortunately, people just totally associate the bigger bagpipe with war. And hence they see it as a sort of a martial instrument. And this plays into the whole thing of why it should have been banned. But what we must remember is that they weren't just played in battle. Like, bagpipes are played for every social occasion in Ireland and Scotland. Like, you know, they were played for funerals. Like, they were played at weddings. They were played at harvests. They were played at like christenings, like the birth of a child. Like, you know, they were played at feast days, festivals, parties, birthdays, everything you can conceive of, where you've got a group of people gathering together in some sort of a celebration. The pipes are played. Of course, not just in Ireland. Like, look at the Flemish paintings and the different pipe scenes from across Europe. And it's not always the lonely shepherd. Like, I know they have that pastoral sort of image as well, and that's there too. But also at sort of occasions, there's hundreds and hundreds of paintings across Europe of pipes being played on all sorts of social occasions. So let's get back to the myth of the whole thing of like where this comes from. So because we've now named them the war pipes in Ireland, they've just this total association with wars and battles. And then what I was led to believe that because of that, the English banned them. And after that ban, we continued to pipe. But what we did was, instead of playing these big, sort of loud, in-your-face, gregarious, like war pipes, where here I come, kind of everyone can see me and hear me, we had to be clever, and we had to make the pipes smaller and quieter and softer and sweeter, so that we could continue to pipe. But this time we were piping indoors. We were piping in secret, in private, and so that we could continue on the tradition of piping, and those pipes turned into uilleann pipes, basically. And that's the myth that I was told, that in Ireland, that after the Gaelic period, like say after the Battle of Kinsale, in the early 1600s, when all the Gaelic customs were finally defeated and crushed and outlawed and all of that, the pipes was yet another instrument to, like the language, that suffered, and the Gaelic games and all of this, and Gaelic laws and everything basically that was Gaelic. This is what I've always been told, right? That the pipes were part of that, and they suffered, and they went into a serious decline, and we had to, as I say, adapt and make them smaller, and then uilleann pipes evolved out of bigger bagpipes, right? I've been told that. And if you look at I kept telling everyone that myself, right? And even, in popular kind of depictions of history or whatever, like the image I chose for this video, it says it all for me, because I saw this image years ago, I think back at school. And it's a scene from 1798, rebellion, around that time anyway. And you can clearly see that there's a piper being hung out of a tree by the neck, and he has they have his pipes kind of strapped onto him somehow, tied up. There's a rope going under his neck around the pipes and tying his hands or his arms at the back of him. So he's hung with his pipes, which is significant, that because that sort of means that's his pipes were a symbol of the rebellious thing that he represents. And it's very, very interesting even to look at his pipes, because they look like a very early version of an uilleann pipe, or maybe a set of union pipes or pastoral pipes. They look bellows blown. I think I can make out the clapper board there, the wooden board in the front, just tucked under the bag. And all the drones seem to issue out of a single stock. So that's interesting as an image in itself, just for looking at what his pipes look like. So they look like bellows blown pipes, but anyway, the whole point of it is the image is that, you know, he's a rebel and he's being hung for being a piper. And again, that same image harkens back to Scotland, because in earlier times you had like Piper James Reid. He's always one of the reference people that's referenced as another proof that pipes were banned as an instrument of war. So this image, it's a very strong image, and it's an image that I grew up with, and it's what, like, we were sort of told, you know. So that's the sort of history of the pipes in Ireland, and how Uilleann pipers and what happened to pipers. And as you can see, there's like red coat, like British soldiers. They're all standing around and laughing and having a great time. And you know, there's two little kids there on the left there. There's the drummer boy and a little chap playing a fife, and they all look like they're having merriment and they're smiling and laughing. And this whole image is like, right, this is what the English done to us. This is it. This is what we've been presented with as our history. But first of all, this is quite important. Believe it or not, like, most of those soldiers and most of those people in that photograph probably aren't even English. They're probably Irish. And this is where people don't like to hear, like, the truth of what history can mean. Most of the regiments that were the British regiments that were on the go in Ireland around the time of 1798, a great many of them were Irish regiments raised in Ireland. They were like militia regiments, and they, you know, to put it into context, like, you had the threat of the French sort of revolution kind of going into Napoleonic times and all of that, and the threat of invasion from France was very great. So because Ireland was seen as the back door, that Britain, the island of Britain, could be attacked from both sides. So they had to have a strong force in Ireland to defend Ireland from the French. So this is why. So there are many British soldiers in Ireland at the time. But what people forget is that a great many of those soldiers were Irish born, and those regiments were Irish regiments. So for a start, we need to think of this as not just this English-Irish conflict. It's not as simple as that. It's a civil war. It's a war of ideas. Like, this republicanism was a new idea. It was a new thing. We were looking at what had just happened in America, in the United States. And then the French, so the American Revolution, and then you had the French Revolution, and then this inspired, which was largely actually a Protestant idea, an educated Presbyterian idea of an independent Ireland. So a Republican idea was a brand new idea at the time. Like, monarchy was the old-fashioned way of doing things. That was the time-tested, tried and tested way of doing things. Most countries came from monarchies or were monarchies at that time, including Ireland itself. We have always had a monarch in Ireland. So even in Gaelic times, there was always chieftains, and then there was always like a local king and then a higher king and all of that. Now, I'm not going to go that far back in time, but what I'm saying is that monarchy wasn't an alien idea back then. Republicanism was this brand new idea, and what I'm trying to get at is that when you look at those soldiers in that photograph, in that sketch, what people don't want to hear in Ireland is that at any given point in time, when the British Army wore the red coat, 1 in every 3 of those red coat soldiers were Irish born, including the officers. Sure, all you have to do is take Sir Arthur Wellesley, right? The Duke of Wellington, who defeated Napoleon Bonaparte, was Irish. He was Irish. An Irish man defeated Napoleon. Wellington wasn't English. He was Irish. And then you might go, oh, well, he was Anglo-Irish. Like, so what? Are you going to go back as far as the Normans? Are we going to go back 800 years? Fitzgeralds and Fitzmaurices, and they were all Normans as well. So this whole thing, this whole thing of the redcoat soldier, 1 in every 3 soldiers, whenever the army wore the redcoat, which was roughly the late 1600s to the late 1800s, around that time period, when the army wore the redcoat, 1 in every 3 of those redcoats was Irish born, up to and including, as I said, the officers. And then people argue back about that. They say, yeah, well, why was that? Yeah, well, that's because the Irish had no choice, because we were put down and we were subdued and we were starving, and it was the only way to get a few bob, and it was the only way to feed your family was to join the army. Blah blah blah. Okay, yeah, but like, are you going to tell me then that that English people were any better off? Like peasants, like poor people in England, and at the same time, I would argue, probably had a worse time off at the time because of the Industrial Revolution. They had shite jobs. They had horrible jobs in factories where they were working like 6 days a week, whatever hours, 12 hours a day, and all of this sort of stuff, since they were children, with machinery. Like, they had children running around between spinning machine parts that were like moving around too fast because adults would get caught in them, and kids, were smaller, so they could like put their little hands and arms into places that, because they'd fit, like risking death and losing arms and fingers and limbs and everything like that. And if you take some sort of a miner, down a coal mine or a copper mine, a child getting lowered down into a dark, dank, freezing cold mine in a bucket on a rope, and doesn't get to see the light of day. It's black dark. It's just candlelit. There's all sorts of gases. They're down there for hours and hours and hours on end. Shit food. Do you think that's what the Industrial Revolution was in England and Wales and other parts of Scotland? The poorer people were never any better off. Like they had miserable existences. They were just there to work. So yeah, they joined the army for the same reason. At least you were above the ground. At least you got to see the light of day. So I would say society across the board, the poorer people in Ireland, like, we're not necessarily worse off. So now we are going to bring in the famine, and then they'll say, yeah, well, what about in the famine then? People were literally starving to death, so like they probably joined the British Army. Then you could understand it. Then, okay, well, here's the figure, right? Irish participation or Irish membership in the British Army was at its peak before the famine in the 1830s. So I'm not going to talk about the famine because that's a whole other topic, right? And I'm not brushing that aside, but the fact, what we're talking about here is it's bagpipes, but it's the image of that piper being hung out of the tree by British soldiers as the classic image of why the instruments are considered an instrument of war and why the English tried to do away with them, right? And for start off, I'm saying we don't know that they're even necessarily English. That's either most likely a local Irish regiment, or 1 in every 3 of those is Irish born, looking at that lad being hung, and they're all having a laugh about it, right? So it's a civil war that's going on. And in the 1830s, the year prior to the famine, right, that was when Irish participation in the British Army was at its highest, not in the worst years of the famine. So that has to be said as well to get that out straight. So what I'm just trying to do is I'm just trying to put things into context here. That it's not always as simple as that. It's not always as simple, and this is the basic thing that we've got the whole time is like the English. It's England's fault for everything, and that's why I'm saying that about these red coat soldiers and all of that. Again, just looking at that picture, that's either an Irish regiment doing it to a fellow Irishman, or at least 1 in 3 of those red coats are Irish. And by the way, as well, 1 in 3 actually made up a disproportionate amount. We made what the Irish actually made up most of the British Army. When you look at what we've got, like 4 countries. We've got 4 countries like Ireland, England, Scotland, and Wales. And out of the 4 countries and the populations of the 2 islands, Ireland still made up a higher 1 in 3 soldiers were 1 in 3 soldiers were Irish in the 1830s, or at any kind of given time. It fluctuated a little bit. Sometimes it was a quarter, sometimes it was like 25% of the army was Irish, and at its peak it went over a third. It was like 35% or something like that. So it went from a quarter to a third. But at its highest point, it was over a third, just slightly over a third. But what those figures in terms of demographics, what those figures mean is that the population of Ireland is smaller than the population of the island of Britain. And you've got 4 countries, and yet 1 country makes up roughly a third of the army. That means that most of the British army were Irish. So, and people always forget as well, British is a collective word. It means England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales. It means the 2 islands. People always just associate Britishness with Englishness because they always see it as London-centric and that it's English-centric, and that's for various reasons as well, of governance and that, whatever. Sure, like the Irish Parliament, like we had our own Parliament, even in the late 1700s, we had our own Irish Parliament that could make up our own laws, and they voted themselves out of existence. So that's why everything's always considered English-centric. But the Britishness, the collective term of Britishness, involves everyone, and involves, like, whether we like it or not. Like, I'm sorry, it's an identity that Irish people don't like anymore, because it's like as if this country was born out of the 1798 rebellion and we never took part in anything. It's another. I often think it's a very dishonest way that lots of Irish people go on about it. It's like as if England went around the world doing all this stuff and like Ireland had absolutely zero part in it. And then just because we become like an independent free state and then a republic, like we got off like scot-free for what the British Army did around the world, when 1 in every 3 of those soldiers was Irish. So we need to really take an honest look at ourselves here and put things into perspective. I would argue these things as being civil wars of ideas on the 2 islands, whether you're talking about Scotland versus England, or like Wales versus England, or Ireland versus England as well. And then don't forget, like, you might say, yeah, how come it's always against England? No, well, hold on, like what about the Bruce invasion of Ireland? So like Scotland invaded Ireland at one time. But then we can go back further and say, well, what about the Kingdom of Dalriada? The Irish invaded Scotland. The Irish invaded parts of Wales as well when the Romans pulled out. So, and Irish had been used as mercenaries in battles in Wales, in England, in Scotland, fighting on one side or another. They didn't really care, just they were getting paid. And the same, the Irish employed mercenaries from Scotland, Wales, and England in Irish battles, in internal struggles. So there's always a pool of people between these 2 islands that's been going over and back to each other since time began. I mean, even the Norman so-called invasion of Ireland was an invitation to Ireland. Like, that's a whole other topic as well we could talk about for hours on end. But, the King of Leinster, Diarmaid MacMurdo, was being done out of his kingdom. Like, it just proves that like Ireland never even saw itself as a whole country. It just saw that whole idea of modern nations and like nation states is really modern and new. It's like for the most part of Irish history, nobody just even considered this whole island one entity. It was always separate kingdoms divided up. So I know I seem to be going off point here that we're supposed to be talking about bagpipes and that pipes were never banned, but I think we really need to talk about this in its historical context, where we're getting all these ideas from, and why is it always that England gets blamed on everything. That's what I'm trying to address. So for the Norman invitation to Ireland, like one Irish king was fighting with another Irish king and they couldn't never agree. Anyway, they were always killing each other, the Irish kings were. So one Irish king goes over to Wales because actually Wales was easier to get to because it's only 60 miles across the water in a boat. And plus they got a whole load of warriors who were far better equipped, far better disciplined, like far better organised, whatever. And King Dermot McMurray won his kingdom back. But then, unfortunately, he lost control of the barons and Normans that arrived over. And then they started taking up land for themselves because they could and because other Irish lords were using them as well and making deals with them saying, come here, like, you know, if we kick the shit out of the Murphys, you know, I'll give you half my kingdom plus my daughter's hand in marriage, and then we can share the Murphys' territory and stuff like that. The Irish collaborated and cooperated with these invaders all the time. And then people will scream, shouting, oh, well, that's because they were traitors. They weren't traitors because there was no such thing as Ireland as a nation. They were just looking out for themselves and their families and their own local communities. And a lot of them were just gangsters as well. Anyway, they were like mafia-style sort of gangsters. So, and it's always, as usual, the poor people that end up suffering mostly from all these sorts of conflicts. But anyway, it's really important just to say that. So, it's just to look at a broader picture of the shit that's out there at the moment. It's pure shy, like this, and as I say, it's all England's fault, and pipes are banned. And as I say, that image that I have on the thing of the piper being hung, like that's the perfect image for where this myth comes from. So this is what I want to address. So I think I've spoken enough about, you know, what's British, what's Irish, what does the piper stand for, and I've made a whole other video about that, the historical image of the piper and the paradox of the piper. Like, so that's I've kind of covered that in another video, I hope, and I'm sure I'll make more videos about it as well. But let's just see. Anyway, let's just get back to this myth. So I'm just going to do, just for the crack, I'm just going to do a quick Google search on pipes being banned. I'm just going to read out some articles which, as I say, perpetuate this myth and why everyone believes it. Right, so I've just found a perfect, like, classic example of an introduction to Ireland and uilleann pipes. And I think this is probably translated badly. Maybe it was done through Google Translate or something. I don't know. But here goes. It just shows you the bullshit that people are reading. Right, I'm not going to say the website that it's from. I'm just going to read out some of the text off it, right? Do you like Irish music and appreciate the typical instruments of the country? We advise you to discover the uilleann pipe. Behind this complicated word lies a magnificent instrument, a true symbol of Irish culture. Yeah. Okay. Now, right, so the uilleann pipe is a true symbol of Irish culture. Okay, just as popular as the harp or the fiddle, the uilleann pipe is in fact an Irish bagpipe. With a particularly recognisable sound. A lot of Irish people play it, but it's complex instrument to play. Okay, history of the uilleann pipe. Now, just wait and hear this. This is the bollocks, right? A history of the uilleann pipe. The Irish bagpipe, an instrument at the beginning prohibited. The uilleann pipe, which means elbow in Gaelic, is a recent instrument which only saw the light of day in the 20th century. Right, I'd argue that that's a bit too basic. This one replaced two old Irish bagpipes with almost identical bellows. Right, so what does that mean? The uilleann pipe replaced two other Irish bagpipes that had identical bellows. Right, which were the union pipes, an instrument used since the 18th century. Okay, fair enough. And then the Pbr, an even older bagpipe that was formerly used during great battles. See, perfect, classic. Well, first of all, the Pbr didn't use a bellows. To the best, every depiction I've seen of it is the Pbr was mouth blown, and it says formerly used during great battles. So that's where you get war pipes from, Pbr. Now, wait till you hear this. This is the total bullshit of it, right? Gets worse. At that time, these two bagpipes were victims of many attempts of prohibition and banishment. The law of Brehon, indeed, aimed at putting an end to the Gaelic order and culture. The law of Brehon tried to put an end to Gaelic culture. The Brehon laws were Gaelic culture. The law of Brehon aimed at putting an end to Gaelic order and culture. Jesus, sorry for taking his name in vain. Like, the Brehon laws were the Gaelic laws. So anyway, let's see what it says. I won't go on too much with this. Prohibiting, in fact, the practice of any Gaelic instrument, like the Irish bagpipe, under the penalty of death. As a reminder, the Irish were already advocating their independence from the British, right? Well, there's the word British. British means Ireland, England, Scotland and Welsh, right? So independence from British, and we're doing it in music using Gaelic instruments like the bagpipe. Right, and then it goes on. After several centuries of struggle, the Irish bagpipe is an instrument less and less known. The British have almost succeeded in banning it completely. Nevertheless, a few enthusiasts refuse to submit and come in contact with luthiers who together create a new bagpipe, the uilleann pipe, a bellows pipe having only slight differences with its predecessors. See, I'm going to stop that there. Like, that's just the shit of that's what we've been told for years, and this is what they're telling foreigners. Right, and you might make an excuse for that because you'd say, right, well, that's probably written by foreigners, so they're getting the information second hand, and the English is a bit shitty, right? So because they thought like that the Brehon laws were actually laws to stop Gaelic culture when Brehon law was Gaelic culture, and the other shit that I've read out, right? So you might say, right, well, you can forgive them because they're foreigners, right? So, but where did they get their information, right? It's second hand. So here's one from an Irish source. I'm not going to read all of the article again, and I'm not going to say where I read it from, but I'll just read it because it's out there, it's public information. Here's one from an Irish source, right? The British, who ruled Ireland but not Scotland, struck a blow against the use of the bagpipe in Ireland in 1366. So they're talking about the Statute of Kilkenny, right? So they're saying that that the British ruled Ireland but not Scotland in 1366. They didn't even rule over all. They've only had pockets of Ireland, and it was the same in Scotland. Like the Norman barons, like went to like William Wallace. Like Wallace is a Norman name. So was Bruce, Robert the Bruce. These were Normans that got to Scotland and intermarried with locals, just like the Normans did over here and took over parts of land. So even the context of this is wrong. The British, who ruled Ireland but not Scotland, struck a blow against the use of the bagpipe in Ireland. In 1366 AD, and then it goes on to say, due to the Irish war pipes' ability to rouse men to deeds of violence and insurrection, the Statutes of Kilkenny was passed, making it a penal offence to have, play, or entertain bagpipers in Ireland. Now that's from an Irish source. It's from an Irish source, and it's from I won't say where it's from, but it's from someone who should know. It's from someone who plays bagpipes. Let's just put it that way, right? So again, we have the whole thing of in the Statute of Kilkenny war pipes, as in because they're totally, as if it was a total instrument of war. The pipe's ability to rouse men to deeds of violence and insurrection, as if that's all the pipe did. And by the way, another thing about Irish piping, as in war pipes, it was like a lot of it was signals. It was a signal instrument, much as a bugle was used. Like if you had a mass of men, a few hundred men, they might not all be bunched together. And don't forget, Ireland was heavily wooded in Gaelic times, like up till like the 1500s, the 1600s. Ireland was far more wooded than what it is now. We didn't have open field systems like we did now. There was bogs and all of that as well, rocky places like mountains. So pipes were often used as a signalling instrument. So the lads over like a half a mile away knew where the other lads were, and sometimes a piper would play a signal tune to get everyone together. Or maybe they'd play a certain thing which means veer off to the left or veer off to the right or stay where you are or whatever, you know. So like it's not just like we heard the bagpipes and we all went berserk like lunatics. That's the way it's written though. That's the way these things are. So that sort of deals with that. The Statute of Kilkenny, a statute was passed making it a penal offence to have, play or entertain bagpipers in Ireland. Right, so that's the Statute of Kilkenny. Statutes. Here's another one. This is a Scottish source, and again, this I won't say where it's from or who wrote it, but it's written by people who should know the history of the bagpipe. They're familiar with the instrument. Just quote, the playing of the bagpipe was banned in Scotland after the uprising of 1745. So it just says it there in black and white. The playing of the bagpipe was banned in Scotland after the uprising of 1745. Actually, I will just read on about this because it actually, this is the whole essence of my argument. This is making all the points I'm talking about. The playing of the bagpipe was banned in Scotland after the uprising of 1745. They were classified as an instrument of war by the loyalist government. They were kept alive in secret. Anyone caught carrying pipes were punished, the same as any man that bore arms for Bonnie Prince Charlie. In 1746 in York, James Reid, here we go, a piper who bore no arms against the English king, was tried for treason. The court came to the conclusion that no Highland regiment ever marched without a piper, and therefore his bagpipes in the eyes of the law was an instrument of warfare. He suffered death on the 6th of November 1746. Okay, so this is where this all comes from, right? So they were banned, and that's the James Reid the piper. And then just listen to this, like the way it's just like there's nothing about the context of pipers were allowed play so long as you were in the government side, nothing about that. And it just says, after the ban was lifted, Highland bagpipe playing really began to emerge, right? They became very popular with Scottish soldiers who carried the instrument to the world over. Like nothing about the British Army. They won't even mention the British Army there. They just says they became popular with Scottish soldiers who carried the instrument the world over, making the sound of the instrument more popular and encouraging others to learn it. So, well, what were Scottish soldiers doing carrying the instrument the world over? But because they were in the British Army, that's why. So, but this article doesn't even credit the British Army with saving the bagpipe or even that dimension of it. So right, that's where this is coming from. I've read out three different articles. One a foreign one that introduces foreigners to the instrument, and here's an introduction to the uilleann pipe. The other one was from an Irish bagpipe source, and the other one was from a Scottish bagpipe source, and they've all said that same thing that I'm arguing against. Right. So this video, I didn't think that my introduction was going to go on for the bones of an hour. Right, so it's obvious to me now that I'm going to have to do it in two parts. I know I've gotten heavy there and I honestly didn't mean it to get, it's too political. I'm not a political person. I'm just trying to look at things solely from a cultural and historical point of view. I don't have an axe to grind with anyone. I don't have an agenda myself. But I think that all of these articles that we're reading do actually, in fact, have an axe to grind and are pointing people in a certain direction. And I just want to counteract that. And I want to look into what's going on with this myth of the ban. And so, and I suppose what I've just done here in part one is I've spoken about the background of the myth of the ban. And so what I'll do now in part two is I'll look at the sources. I'll look at the statutes of Kilkenny and discuss them. We look at the Disarming Act 1715, 1716, 1725, 1746, the Dress Act, and Piper James Reid. We'll look at each of this is where these myths are coming from. So we need to look into each of those myths and pull them apart. And I'll read out I'll go to the actual sources, read them out, and discuss them. And so hopefully we'll get to the end of this and try and try and at least see, reflect some light on the opposite side of this argument that's been just perpetuated right throughout the internet. But even, as I say, way before the internet, even when I was in school and the education that I got growing up in the history books and all of that image of the Piper being hung as a rebel symbol and all that, that's, we need to, as I say, go back to the original sources and tease out these things, these strands in this big tangled up mess that's just after coming out with one conclusion, that basically the British/English banned the bagpipe in Ireland and Scotland. It's a myth. So let's find out part two. Let's have a look at actual facts of it. Thanks for listening this far, and see you the next time.